Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
The latest war in the Middle East has shown just how vulnerable Australia is to global shocks. And in general, international stability is retreating on multiple fronts. In this uncertain world, Australians are anxious about the future, with concerns over further economic shocks, AI disinformation and cyber attacks, the continuing impacts of climate change, and also terrorism and defence. This is according to a survey from ANU's National Security College released this week. The survey of more than 20,000 Australians was taken at different points between November 2024 and February 2026. It covers attitudes and concerns about a broad spectrum of security issues. It includes focus group work as well as quantitative polling. To unpack the results, we speak today to one of the report's authors, Professor Rory Medcalf, who heads the National Security College. Rory Medcalf, the survey covers a range of different threats, from war to economic shocks. Can you tell us what Australians are most worried about?
So we did attempt to assess Australian community attitudes to a whole range of threats, a whole range of risks, if you like. And we were deliberately careful not, for example, to name names. We weren't naming countries. We weren't naming adversaries. We wanted to know what people wanted to protect and what they saw the risks as. And so the cluster of issues that I think the greatest concern was about tended to be what I guess academics would call non-traditional security issues, the contemporary stuff. So we're looking at technology-related threats, the weaponisation of artificial intelligence, cyber attacks. We're also looking at threats where economics and security intersect. So threats to critical infrastructure and to supply chains and the possibility of an economic crisis affecting the continuity of daily life. And I think in all of those issues, from our focus groups and our interviews to build on the survey data, there was a clear recognition that security in the minds of the community is about the continuity of everyday life, whether it's having confidence in the economic future of the country or the fabric of society holding together, or the sovereignty of the country and how all those things tie together. Now, we can come to it later in the conversation. There was also concern about more military issues, including the possibility of war. And those things matter, but they weren't in the top list of likelihood concerns.
Your work spanned from late 2024 to quite current February this year. Did you see noticeable changes in people's mindsets between those times?
We did. And, one of the disturbing findings of this, which I think we just need to face up to as a nation, is that anxiety levels have grown, and they've grown both in general but on specific issues over the 15 months or so that we recorded the data. The general sense of concern about Australia's national security, I am worried about Australia's national security, was the statement we were testing. We saw levels go from a minority, I think it was around 42% of the population, to a significant majority, 64%, over that 15-month period. And then on some specific issues, and particularly terrorism, and of course the atrocity of the Bondi terrorist attack is what punctuated that narrative, we saw very high rises in concern, including among younger Australians, who went from something like a 22% concern about terrorism as a serious security risk through to 55% from July last year until February this year.
Now, your survey didn't cover the recent American-Israeli attack on Iran, but it did cover the US strikes on Iran in 2025. What did Australia think about those strikes, and what did Australians think about those strikes, and do you think those perceptions would have changed in this war?
I can't offer a lot of clarity on that one, Michelle, because in July last year we asked very general questions about, for example, conflict overseas or impacts of shocks on economic supply chains. Obviously, those things relate very much to what we're talking about, but we deliberately didn't name conflicts or name countries. So there was no specific mention of the war in Ukraine, there was no specific mention of Gaza, and there was no specific mention of the US-Israeli attack on Iran in the middle of last year. There was no specific mention either of, for example, China's military assertiveness in our region. But if I were to look at the levels of concern in the middle of last year about the risk of conflict, so I think almost more than two-thirds of the population, even then, 68, 69%, thought that within 5 years Australia would be involved in conflict overseas. Between 70 and 80% were concerned about the threats to economic supply chains as a serious security threat and saw a high probability of that occurring and saw also major consequences of those things occurring. What I would say is that the common sense of the community even then could tell that the interconnectedness of the global system was going to hurt our economy through conflicts overseas, such as the crisis in the Middle East last year. And of course, that is now magnified by what we're seeing right now with the conflict in the Gulf and all of those implications. So we stopped collecting data at the beginning of February. We weren't able to capture recent events.
A few years ago, when we were having really major bushfires, of course we've had many since, but sort of peak bushfires in 2019, 2020, climate change was very much dominating the headlines and I think people's attention. Do you find that the climate issue has receded somewhat as a popular concern, or is it as strong as ever?
Look, I don't think it's receded, and the last thing I want to do is to be publishing research that somehow suggests it should be treated as a secondary issue. Climate change, or the impacts of climate change, and also another category which we call natural disasters on an unprecedented scale. Now, you can very well argue that those are the same thing, but we wanted to give the community the opportunity to look at those as two ways into the problem. They registered consistently as high concerns, as in that the higher end, not the very top, but the higher end of concerns across the community. They were much more pointed, though, among younger Australians, and there was a very clear difference between younger and older Australians on that issue. Younger Australians were more concerned. On the other hand, when you looked at the question of the likelihood of shocks, the climate issue actually probably rated highest in terms of inevitability. I think it was about 89% of the population say that this will happen as a security risk for Australia within the next 5 years. It will have impacts. Interestingly, when the impacts were measured, the threat or the risk where a higher proportion of the population described the potential harm within the next 5 years as catastrophic, however, was the possibility of military attack. But a very high proportion of Australians nonetheless are worried about climate change and see it as a security issue in our view.
One theme that comes through is that people feel that we are, as a country, generally somewhat underprepared. Why do you think they do feel that?
Well, firstly, that is a key conclusion from the data. I think underprepared is the right word. It's not unprepared, but it's certainly not well prepared either. So, of all the 15 issues that we canvassed with the population, most issues charted levels of the nation being very or fully prepared. Between maybe 4% and 10% of the population answered the question in that way. Most people on most issues think we are slightly or moderately prepared, and perhaps that's okay, but I don't know about you, I wouldn't want to go into a grueling test of some kind and only feel slightly prepared. Again, this goes to the common sense question, Michelle. I think there is a recognition that for many, many years, Australian government across the political spectrum, federal, state, at all levels of government, have tended not to treat preparedness for crises or preparedness for shocks as a priority. It's something that perhaps small teams of officials do quietly, but not enormous resources are devoted to them. And of course, you could argue that with an economy that is primarily about efficiency rather than about resilience, that's an understandable trade-off. The decision was made, I guess, many years ago that catastrophic shocks are not likely and therefore shouldn't be treated as a first-order priority of government. The big question now is that we're in a world where shocks are cascading and where the cost of preparedness, however great it is, may well end up being very small alongside the cost of failing to prepare when shocks strike. So I think intuitively the public is perceiving that. Where I think Australians do feel a bit more prepared, and this came through in our interviews in rural and regional communities, is against the shocks and crises we've had before. So bushfires, floods, the shocks that we feel in rural Australia every year. There is a community level sense of awareness and preparedness, but this doesn't necessarily translate into urban Australia across the society.
Australians seem to be becoming more pessimistic about national security and indeed the threat of war. Do you think that this is solely or largely the Trump factor, or are there other circumstances? And it's interesting that this has occurred when in our region we've got a much better relationship with China than we used to have.
It's clear that the Trump factor has had a real impact here. So we took our first of 3 surveys in November 2024, second July 2025, the third in February 26, and we've seen a ratchet of anxiety across that time. We've also seen issues like, for example, the failure of the international rules-based order becoming of great concern. In February 2026, although this was the only time we did take that sounding, I think 72% of the population said this was a serious security issue that would affect Australia within the years ahead. I hesitate to draw a verified line of causation between Donald Trump and Australian security anxieties, but there's so much, there's so much by way of evidence that suggests that's the way people feel. So the concern about supply chain security, the concern about the rules-based order, the concern about risks of conflict, all of that registers in our numbers. In our qualitative work, our focus group interviews, our interviews around the country, the submissions process that we ran alongside the surveys, that's where a lot more of the discomfort about the Trump administration and the state of the alliance with the United States does come through. And although it's hard to say that these are representative points of view, these are individual qualitative interviews that we did, we can't say that they speak for the whole country. There was a clear sense that the alliance is not what it used to be. At the same time, I would hesitate to say that somehow there's been a public mood of greater comfort with China. So we deliberately didn't go naming China as the adversary or the potential threat, even though you could argue that there's a pretty small number of countries that would have the potential or even the reason to pose a military threat to Australia in the future, and China is one of them. But at the same time, we did have a lot of concern expressed to us about the preservation of Australian democratic rights and freedoms, the resistance to foreign interference, and in a couple of cases, people citing the data point of the Chinese Navy circumnavigating Australia last year after its weapons exercises as a reason for us to be concerned about our security. So I don't think it's true that we've somehow suddenly recognise China as the source of stability and the United States as the source of all instability, but there is much greater discomfort with the United States qualitatively than there was. And at the same time, there's a recognition that we're in a world of unforgiving great powers that will do really what they want if the rules don't constrain them.
So did a feeling come through that many people would like Australia to move away from the United States, to become a more independent middle power to follow the sort of route that's been discussed by the Canadian Prime Minister?
In the survey work we did, we don't have an evidence base for that. We don't have an answer one way or another because they really weren't the questions that we were asking. But we did have, as I said, concern about the rules-based order eroding or even failing. We did have concern about the risk of conflict. But at the same time, there's clearly also a sense of concern about military threats to Australia, and quietly, I think a lot of Australians would still look to China as a source potentially of that military threat. When it comes to the diplomacy question, again, most of our survey work was really about national security rather than statecraft on the international stage. But in the qualitative work we did, the focus groups, the interviews, there was some very positive comment about the middle power diplomacy that Australia has pursued, particularly under this government. So the work with Southeast Asia, the work with South Pacific in particular. And there was also, I think, a pretty clear recognition that however we work with the Americans, we need to do it in an interest-based way on our own terms. Certainly a number of our interviewees and certainly a few of our authors of submissions to the process were very sceptical about AUKUS and the strategic logic of that. Not saying that there was no strategic logic, but that it hadn't been clearly articulated enough.
In terms of communications, did people feel that the government was really keeping them in the dark about a lot of issues, or did they feel that basically the government was trying to be transparent enough?
The short answer to that is that a majority, and I'm saying 53%, which is a majority of respondents to our surveys, don't think government shares enough information with them about national security or about the various issues that we listed in our surveys. At the same time, only 4% think government is giving them too much information, and the rest are kind of in between for different reasons. I think some are probably okay with the levels of information sharing, some probably don't trust a thing any government would say, and others, I think, are probably focused quite radically on transparency and would think that even a little bit more information sharing isn't enough. We don't have enough fidelity on those numbers. But on the 53% who do want more information from government and clearer communication, it's not fair to assume that they want some kind of radical transparency where suddenly all the information about all the security risks is dumped into the public debate. There was a huge amount of concern across the community about the polluted information environment, disinformation, the damage to social cohesion that causes. And in our focus groups, there were some very thoughtful observations by a number of people to say that, look, we'd like to know more, but we do not want government to trigger panic through, dumping all of its secrets into the public about the threats and risks we face. We heard quite a lot of people putting faith, for example, in the operational security agencies, ASIO, the Federal Police, the Australian Signals Directorate, effectively saying, we trust them to get on with doing their job protecting us, and if they do communicate publicly about their work, which, for example, the ASIO Director General has done, and he was named in one of these focus group discussions, then we consider their messages to be quite credible. But we are concerned when politicians speak about national security because they will inevitably politicise it, they'll weaponise it for electoral purposes. So there's a nuanced view of that communication issue. I think the way this could be simplified is to say that a lot of people, a majority, want simplification of national security messages and clarity and more communication than there is at the moment. They want to be informed, but what they don't want is panic or constant threat amplification. So this is a really delicate task for government, but there's a clear sense that they could do better.
There's obviously a lot of worry about AI. Is this people concerned about their own employment or concerned about the unknown, not understanding AI? What's that all about?
Well, you'll recall that when we released a little bit of our data as a preview at the end of last year, which I know that the conversation reported on, so thanks for that. The headline there was the fact that the weaponisation of artificial intelligence, or the use of artificial intelligence to enable attacks on Australian people or businesses, was in fact the risk that rated most highly as a serious concern among Australians. About 78% saw it as a major or moderate threat in the years ahead. However, we went and tested that with a subsequent round of polling where we ran that alongside a question on cyber attacks. And there's been plenty of polling over the years about cyber security, which is why we originally hadn't highlighted cyber security in our first rounds of data collection. But we thought we'd better test the AI conclusion, and we did, and we found that the results were almost identical. That is, Australians equally rate cyber attacks as a priority risk and threat. And I guess that leaves us with a few conclusions. One is that technology-enabled threats to Australians, to their businesses, to individuals, to the country, tend to be lumped together in the public mind as a sort of a coalescence of threats, which makes sense because, of course, these days, online threats probably often are AI enabled, even though they're using cyberspace as the vector to reach our businesses or our accounts. At the same time, in the focus groups and the interviews, it certainly became clear that there is a large anxiety about the unknown, and AI is in a way the ultimate emblem at the moment of the unknown future. Ways in which it could be good for us, but ways in which it could be very bad for us. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done to bring the Australian community on a journey of assurance and security about what AI means for them, whether it's in employment, but whether it's in national or personal security as well.
Your work shows that there are a lot of people who want an increase in Australia's social cohesion. But as the weeks and months go on, we seem to be seeing that increasingly fractured. And of course, we're talking in the wake of the South Australian election, where One Nation got a very strong vote and is seen as a challenge in many ways to social cohesion. How difficult do you think this issue is now becoming for the Australian public and indeed for governments?
I would connect a few of the themes of our research in answering that question, Michelle. One is the theme of social cohesion, whether it's to do with trust or whether it's to do with polarisation or whether it's to do, frankly, with political violence, the risk of political violence or terrorism within the Australian community. But I would tie all of this to the disinformation question, the polluted information environment, which is kind of a thread that runs through so many of the risks that we talk about here, whether it's foreign interference or political violence or other issues as well. Very clearly, a lot of the security issues where there were high levels of concern are related to social cohesion, terrorism, violent unrest, political violence targeting parts of the Australian community where we had a very specific question. And of course, at one level, that's code for anti-Semitism, but at another level, it's code for other forms of targeted political violence that may occur in the future. If you were in New Zealand, you'd read it as code for what happened at Christchurch and that atrocity some years ago. In our interviews and our focus groups, we found a lot of concern about polarisation. We found a lot of concern about the impact of political polarisation leading to greater mistrust of institutions and opening the way to political violence in this country. We don't have clear data on that. We didn't put political polarisation as a question in our surveys. Is this or is this not a security threat? And of course, different people will see political polarisation different ways. For some people, it's simply the way they may be inclined to vote for whatever reason, whereas for others, they see it as a threat to the systems. For example, a two-party system that we've all grown up with. So this is an area for future work, whether it's in our research or in the ways that organisations like ours can assist institutions, government and the public to maintain that sense of cohesion in Australia that I think is key to continuity of normal life and to the balancing of our rights and freedoms in a democracy and in a federated multicultural democracy with the need to be secure in a contested world.
Overall, I think it's fair to say that your survey presents a pretty pessimistic picture, with people worrying about a whole range of threats and risks, and certainly opinion is not getting any more optimistic. But can you just finally give us anything on the bright side that's come out of this research?
Look, absolutely. And the way that I would approach this pessimism-optimism debate is to say that security is never something that we should be either pessimistic or optimistic about. Security is, literally meaning a state of mind of being without care. Security is not about absolute protection from all threats at all times, but nor is it about ignoring problems, being complacent. In a way, we can only have no worries in Australia if we worry a bit. And so this report was intended to bring a lot of those issues to the surface, to help us look in the mirror so that we can, I hope, find ways to be more cohesive and more confident as a nation in facing up to these issues. And there were some green shoots, there were some bright rays that we discovered. One, I think, was the public appetite for more information, the fact that people are engaged. A lot of the people we met in our almost 500 interviews around the country at first said, well, why are you talking to me about national security? And these were people who might, for example, be local government representatives, mayors, local business people, community leaders, civil society leaders, people whose daily business is not national security. But over the space of an hour's structured conversation, they had very strong views about community resilience, and they had good stories to tell about their local community resilience. They're willing to do more, but their desire for greater coordination with a regional or a state or a national effort. We also encountered, I think, two very positive points of convergence in all of the difference and divergence that we have in this society. One of those was the emphasis on safe and peaceful communities as a number one priority around the country, and we have survey data on that, where 2/3 of Australians see safe and peaceful communities as either their top priority or their second priority, out of a limited list we gave them that included prosperity, democratic rights and freedoms, and also, interestingly, national security in the abstract. So I'm not a fan at all here of saying that somehow an abstract sense of national security is more important than safety at a local level. It's about bringing those ideas together. And the last point that I took some hope from going forward was the response to a question we posed specifically in the aftermath of the Bondi terrorist attack, which was to say that in the aftermath of that anti-Semitic atrocity, do all Australians have a responsibility to help keep our communities peaceful and safe? We got a 71% yes to that question. 32% of respondents agreed strongly with that proposition. Only 8% disagreed. So I think there are some foundations there to work harder towards a coherent national security response that respects the differences in Australian society, but brings the conversation closer to the community, brings the community into the conversation, and perhaps adapts our priorities as we go on that journey.
Rory Medcalf, thank you very much for sharing the insights of your report. I'm sure many people will dip into it and read the full findings. That's all for today's Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet? Please follow.
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland
We are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
to the heart of Australian politics, this is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out. Now, no one's laughing. One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation.
I'm back.
This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.